Welcome to the DevReady podcast, where we're helping non-techs build great tech. Today, we're fortunate enough to be joined by Apurva Chiranewala, and I hope they got that correct, but probably didn't, but that's okay. Who's been a part of the world of Catch of the Day, eBay, but then also gone into startups and ventured out in that sort of realm. And we'll have a bit of a history on that from Apurva and talk a little bit about that. But the context of today is to how do you start from zero without going VC route? And the reality is you can't go VC route at zero. You need to build a track record anyway. Is it first customer? How might you pay for products? If it's technology, has some experience in brick and mortar startups as well. So there's a lot we can unpack in this. Apurva, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Andrew. I'm really excited about today.
It should be good fun. Let's dig in a little bit of background first, just set the context of where you've been. I don't have to jump in too much into that, but the whole premise of it, it's sort of how we might begin a startup at the end of this. But tell us the audience a little bit about who you are and how you ended up in Australia, and we'll go from there.
Sure. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Originally Indian, grew up in India. My background's predominantly as a software engineer. So I've been involved with one of the largest e-commerce marketplaces out of India originally, which was subsequently backed by SoftBank and still remains to be one of the top e-commerce marketplaces in the region. Had to move to Australia for personal reasons, things to do with my father's medical health. But anyways, was really excited to get to the shores. Was very fortunate to meet with some really cool tech founders very early on. So Gabby and Hezi were building Catch out at the time. They were very keen to pivot into a marketplace model that subsequently became the Catch marketplace. So had the privilege to work with the team at Catch very early on to build the version one of that. Subsequently was at eBay, building the shipping and logistics ecosystem for eBay very early on when they were threatened by Amazon and just about to enter the market. So there was some really bits of interesting experience there in the shipping logistics space. And then was part of the founding team at Sendle, worked very closely with the founders at Sendle to actually build out the Sendle ecosystem, which was Australia's first carbon neutral shipping provider. And then more recently pivoted into fintech with Charlie and Jordan, my other co-founders, in the form of Block Earner, which was actually creating the first form of early stage blockchain based banking type services in the region. So yeah, have been very privileged to work with some really smart folks.
There's a bit of a background there. We can unpack a lot of it, but not the premise of today. So just a little bit around the Catch. There's been some challenges with Catch, as we know. What was it like jumping into a business that was growing? Catch is a massive brand that grew exponentially in Oz, and started off with one product. I remember it was back. I can't remember when it started, but it was a long time ago. I think it was even uni days, a long time ago. Yeah, one product. Let's buy that for the day, and it just expanded out to this juggernaut of an organisation. And unfortunately, it hasn't gone too well over the past year or two. But what was it like just jumping into that when you got into Oz off the back of coming out of India?
Yeah, I mean, you take me back about 12, 15 years, right?
Yeah, a long way,
It's
way,
been a
way
while
back.
since I've been
Yeah,
here.
yeah.
Yeah, look, first off, straight away, I think the cultural difference was the big one for me personally, right? Like the
It would
work
be
culture,
different, yeah.
yeah, the work
Yeah,
ethic. I think India was at the stage when I left India in very early stages of its tech boom.
yes.
It had so it was a lot hungrier in some way, a lot more fast growing as a market. I think it still is. It's playing a lot of catch up in some ways. I think Australia was a bit more established as a
Okay.
market, so I think that that sort of translated into better access to capital. I know in Australia we tried to think we had fewer VCs and so on and so forth. You go to markets like India back in 2010, there was zero VCs.
Zero, yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
I think you always had to go internationally and find capital outside. And as I said, SoftBank was one of the big ones that first came into India with its $100 billion fund and so on and so forth. So very early on, I think it was the culture, B, the appetite for growth. Again, Australia being a more established market, growths were perceived to be double-digit percentage points. In India, it was usually triple-digit percentage points a
Okay.
year,
Yeah, just
right?
want more. Just
Yeah,
100% a year, or
yeah. So
whatever that might be. Yeah.
Yeah, and that usually translated it into very different decision making, right? So, I mean,
Of
depending
course it
on what
does.
you put
Yeah.
as a pressure on your
Yeah.
growth. So, I think that was a really interesting experience in the beginning, just to notice the differences, work with the different culture, neutralize my accent. I didn't sound like this 12 years ago, I promise.
You've evolved a long way. Accent is obviously evolved over the years. Blockchain. What was the pivot for you? Where did it sort of come from? Obviously, you were in Sendle business we've worked with in the past with integrations for packet for deliveries and bits and pieces. That would have been experience, but you had obviously a logistics and e-commerce background for quite a while. What was the pivot into blockchain and why did that come about?
Yeah, interesting question. And it's really hard to describe the exact moment when you start thinking of the pivot. So it wasn't a moment. And I think, as you would ask many people in the fintech space who believe in blockchain or some form of crypto and are involved with crypto, I think it's always a journey. The same happened with me. I think, prior to moving into the crypto ecosystem, I was already dabbling with different forms of crypto, not just buying and investing in, but also playing with solutions that was helping
Okay.
me borrow or do other sort of replace traditional banking in some ways with some of the crypto ecosystem. So as I was already involved with e-commerce, there were times when I had an e-commerce store of my own, just from an experimental standpoint, and I would often pay my suppliers using crypto in China. So it was a lot easier for me to actually build a business using crypto because I'd already dabbled in stable coins in some way, shape, and form, understood how to sort of do transactions without having to take permission from the bank. So permissionlessness was the key sort of hook for me to start looking at crypto more seriously as a way to be able to borrow and spend.
Got
And
it.
I think that was sort of the seed that allowed me post COVID to actually look at it more seriously.
From a fintech standpoint, it's a evolving market, the world of crypto, as we know, and it's always changing. It's a challenging market too. There's a lot of people just looking to make a dollar out of it. The technology is evolving quickly. When do we think it might get to a point where it's actually across the ecosystem and we can pay in crypto when we walk into a cafe? And it's really not there, and I think Bitcoin is not the answer to that. So maybe it's the rails behind the banking system that it becomes, and that's the obviously the Ripple side of things, or what they're attempting to do. What's your thoughts being around that
Yeah.
space for a little while?
It's such a great question, Andrew. And this is something I can talk all evening with a beer with you about, but
Yeah, I think
I'll
we
try and
catch up.
condense that
Yeah,
into a 30
yeah,
second response.
yeah.
Look, I think, in my personal opinion, I've looked at tech, I find a lot of similarities between e-commerce and crypto. And
Yep.
when I say similarities, not just in tech, but also how people get these two got these two technologies wrong in the very early days. So when I was back in India, in the very early days, uh, and we were building an e-commerce business, a lot of time brick and mortar businesses or brick and mortar retail businesses would always challenge us and say, so do you see a future where everything is bought online? How will you buy a sofa online? How will you buy a shoe online? And so on and so forth. And it took me a while to understand that I think it's a human tendency to look at it as binary, where if this happens, then that has to die.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
I think there is a similar fallacy with regard to crypto. I think crypto over time has emerged as an alternative, not a replacement for the existing system. And the way I see it is there will be certain use cases where traditional banking and the traditional finance and the traditional central banks don't solve an edge case or a use case. And crypto is trying to fill those cracks and gaps in the developing world, right? In places like Australia, where banking is robust and people have access and 80, 90% of the population is banked, I think we struggle to see the use case for crypto. I think,
We
but there
do.
are other
Yeah.
parts of the world, El
Third world
Salvador,
countries.
Argentina,
Yeah. Of
and all these
course. Very
places
much.
where the traditional
Yes.
banks and the governments have actually failed, you actually see the access to crypto as a critical point. And it sort of goes back to, we were talking about the use case for solar in Africa. It's again a very similar thing. It's not going to replace the grid. It's going to be an alternative to the gaps in the infrastructure where people are not able to fix those.
Also, I would say there's probably a bigger problem to solve in those parts of the world than there is, like you said, in Oz. Good answer in terms of what it might become, and I think you're correct. Where people see new technology and the fear is even AI. Right now, it's going to replace all our jobs. This is what people are saying. Um, But is that the reality? Is it going to support us to do different things as a culture, as a society? Is it going to speed up evolution and innovation? It is going to do that. We used to build one-story houses, then we
Mm.
invented cranes and all these things that enable us to build 50, 100-story skyscrapers. And this is
But we
what I
still have
see for
houses
that
and we
technology.
still have skyscrapers.
Yes, we have a
Yeah.
bit of everything. So it's a good
Mm.
analogy to look at it from that perspective in terms of what technology can do to
Mm.
support bigger investment and infrastructure. And that will happen in the world of technology and what it's always done, really.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, startup. What fascinates you about the world of startup? Because you've been around it for quite a little while now.
Mm.
What's the difference between that corporate world and that startup world? What gets that smile on your face? Because right now you're lit up. So what is it that lights you up about the world of startup and really venturing into the unknown? Because that's what it becomes when you jump in this path.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting that I had this exact conversation 2 days ago with
Yeah.
somebody else who's trying to leave the
Yeah.
corporate world, and she
Okay.
told me that she needs somebody to hack her brain to convince her because she's at Google. I'm not going to name her, but
Sure.
she's like she's been trying to leave Google for a while, but she needs somebody to hack her brain. And it's interesting. I was telling her exactly this. I was like, I don't have a disdain for the corporate world. I've heard a lot of people talk
Mm-hmm.
about soul crushing and all of those things. I actually think the corporate world has played a very important role in my life, where I look at it as a pit stop in my journey in life. So every time I run out of ideas, or if I want to create a bit of investment capital, so I want to
Mm-hmm.
save money, or if I want to learn something about the industry at the corporate cost, not having to go to conferences at my own dime and so on and so forth, I would
Sure.
usually switch into a corporate role where I'm learning in the job, I'm seeing the best practices in the industry, taught by the McKinseys and so on and so forth. And then after a couple of years of gaining that information, I want
Mm-hmm.
to go try it out myself and see what portions of that apply to another business or so on. So I have always looked at corporates as a good pit stop in my career before I go out again for 3 to 5 years to start building again. And if I keep getting ideas, if I keep getting energy to keep building, then I keep building. But if I get tired, get beaten down a little bit, I again take a step back and look for that next corporate gig for a couple of years. I haven't done that in a while. I haven't
Yeah.
done that in the last 5 years or so. So maybe I'm not sure if I'm any more employable in the corporate space. We'll find out if that were to happen. But interestingly, I look at it as a sine wave where, when your creativity peaks, you go back out, build something of your own, use your own capital, back yourself, take that ADHD approach to doing like five different things at the same time. And when you're like, I've had too much of that, I need some sanity, and I just need a 9 to 5 for a little bit to be able to just work on my body, work on my gym,
Yeah.
get it back into meditation. I just take up a corporate role for a bit.
That's a first I've ever heard that and probably a great way to think about it in terms of. I'll probably dig in a bit more. What's your vision of your life story? Is it all about the ability to create? Do you see yourself as a creator, and that's why you take that dynamic of I could jump into corporate anytime just to evolve my thinking and learning, and then I
Mm,
can hop back in and out because that's probably the first time I've heard that
mm.
description of how we might work in the world of corporate.
Yeah, well, I mean, the answer to this might sound a bit like
Yes.
coming from a functional hippie, but I'm going to try and give it a shot. Uh, I think the more recent objective in the last 5 to 6 years has been to try and live a more full life,
Okay.
and
Yeah.
and I think to unpack what full life really means is to potentially be able to experience the entire spectrum of what living or being a human being means. And a lot of that means that hypothetically, if I only experienced success or financial success, then I would have not experienced failures, which would be a complete different chapter in my life, where I wouldn't know how to deal with them, where I wouldn't know how to deal with challenges. I wouldn't know what it's like to wake up with a feeling like you've been hit by a brick on your head, and what are you going to do the whole day. To live a full life, you want to wake up feeling super successful, pumped, but at the same time, days where you're like really nervous. You don't know what's going to happen on that day, if you're going to survive the end of the day or not. And I think in order, by the time I finish my life, and you never know when it's going to be, you want to be able to look back and say, I kind of lived a full life where I experienced the ups and downs to the fullest. I just didn't get sugar all the time. I also got the salt, and I also got the bitter, all the tastes that come in the entire palette of taste. So for me, I think that is the real objective. And I think usually every time I find myself for a longer period of time experiencing the same taste over and over again, corporates tend to bring you that. Sometimes even in a startup environment, you get into your comfort zone and you just sort of work within that. I try to change that. So maybe it's classic ADHD mindset. Maybe it's the beauty of the world we live in today, where you can always disrupt yourself and look for something else. It could. I'm not really sure. I don't have a therapist long enough to tell me why I do this, but I think that's what I'm pursuing.
That's it's fascinating. I think it's more from what I'm hearing is you don't want to be in your comfort zone for too long, so you're jumping out and looking for new. You're probably there's something I've done across our business which is wealth dynamics. Go check it out if you've never seen it before. I'm sure you're in the creator star realm of thinking, as in you're more in that creator, want to get out, have a conversation, evolve new things, work with people to disrupt. I'd say that's where you probably sit. If you look at it from that dynamic. But I would agree, if you want to jump into business or in the world of business, you're going to have these ups and downs, and it's the reality. We're going to go through days where we don't know how we're going to pay the bills. That's going to happen. There's going to be days where things are flying, and you're thinking, okay, but then you remember the days where you struggle to pay the bills, and you go, okay, things are going really well. What do we need to de-risk? Because you got to think not every the things go in cycles and things need to evolve, and we always need to be evolving as business
100%.
leaders, as people, and we're always learning. So I think it's a fascinating sort of jumping in and out of things. I've done the same thing, but I
Mm,
haven't for the past 7 years. I've never worked in corporate for a day in my life. I've worked and supported corporates, but I've never been in that environment, so I don't understand that environment at all.
mm,
But in the evolution of business, it's evolved probably 7 or 8 times across the
mm,
journey because it needs to. Everything evolves, everything changes. So
mm.
we learn a lot being in that sort of changing environment all the time.
Yeah. No,
Yeah,
no, that's really true,
yeah,
true, Andrew. And
mm,
just one thing I might want to add there is, a lot of times I look at the world in grays and less in black and white. As I said, I don't think one wins and the other loses. And there's a lot of gray area where things are all overlap. And same with my appreciation for both corporate and the startup life. I feel like startups at a certain scale act like corporates. So to
yes,
pretend like we built a startup that will
yeah,
never be a corporate and it'll be
yeah.
always white and not black
The
and
goal is
whatnot.
to technically get it to a corporate if people think about it. People come to me and say, I
Yeah,
want to build a unicorn. Well, you're looking to build a corporate entity in the long
like
run.
Google was a
Has to
startup
be.
at some point,
Yes,
right?
everything was.
eBay was a startup at some point,
The
right?
companies we admire and the brands we admire
Yeah,
always started at zero at some level.
100%.
Yeah.
And the reality is that corporates are an epitome of business organization
Mm.
that humans know today is the only way to scale and function. So the moment you get a 1,000 people company, it will act like a corporate. Human
Yes.
politics, all of those things that suck
You'll come
people
into
out. So you're sort of trying to kill yourself if you're an entrepreneur anyway.
it. I'll leave it there because there's plenty to unpack for people to think about as they walk into this world. Let's look at it. You've worked in a number of startups. You've looked at different funding models. You're currently building a bunch of hostels throughout India, from what I understand. Is that correct? Yes.
That's right. Yeah.
Also working on Demtech, which is your main one that you're involved in. I'll let you unpack a little bit about that. Your philosophy
Sure.
offline when we chatted was all about how might we not go down the VC route. And I think people just assume that they're going to start something and just go get VC funding. And the reality is we need runs on the board before VC is going to look at us. The reality is either we have proven ourselves in some startups and some monster exits and we can get VC funding very easily via network. If we're starting off the back of a PowerPoint slide, that's not going to happen. So we need other ways of funding from zero. Let's talk about that and talk about how you've built your startups from that mentality rather than let's chase the VC funding and why you've done that too.
Sure. Maybe I'll start with the why, and then we can go to the
Yeah.
how. The how.
Yep.
Look, I think since we've already covered, as you know very well, that I've been part of the VC journey several times now, right? So I know what it feels like. I know how good it feels when you get that initial round, and I know how it feels how quickly when you run out of that money because you're mandated to spend it in a certain way, right? It's happened far too many times to me. We've already spoken about a few instances where,
Hmm.
in the long run, it hasn't ended well for the company that we've been in
Yes.
conversation about. And at some point, especially post COVID, I think there was an opportunity for me to, I was traveling in Europe. I was caught up in a blizzard in a winter cabin in Norway, in minus 19 degrees, when I had this epiphany for like, 3 days in a row, just stuck looking at
Stuck
snow.
in a box.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I kind of had this epiphany where I was like, hey, I got to change something in my life. And I know it always sounds like as if this was all planned and it sounds great, but when it was happening, you didn't have that clarity. But in hindsight, it sounds like that's what really happened. And I think at that point, I realized that I've been through this on this horse of a VC funded startup several times now. And it's great to a certain degree when you win some and you lose some, but it's almost perpetually being in what sometimes I refer to as the breadline, right? You're always you get the bread, you go back into the bread line, right? And I just feel the value creation is very limited in that ecosystem because often you hack your brain to just be in the bread line.
It probably goes down the give a man a fish, he eats for a day. Teach a man a fish, he eats for a lifetime mentality. If you
Yeah,
think that way around VC,
yeah,
you're always looking for that fish. You're after the bigger
yeah,
fish to keep feeding,
yeah,
which is a tough place to be on that. You're on that roller coaster and you can't get off. That's what I've seen being
yeah,
around that world. I've never been in a. I've been invested in. We've invested in from a low end in certain these VC funder routes, and that's what it feels like. They're just on
yeah.
that roller coaster, and you can't get off. Yeah.
100%, 100%. And I'd second that, right? Like, I think a lot of founders start with the right intent to actually go and build something valuable and use the VC money to build, to get to that end state of building. But
Yes.
along the way, I think people lose track of that they set out to solve a problem and they actually start looking at VC fundraising as the problem, right? And then all you're doing is constantly just trying to figure out where will my next round come from and next round come from, and that original problem sort of falls onto the wayside. It just becomes a subtext of what you're trying to do. Um,
Which is a bit scary, right? Because the reality is to we're in business, and business needs to be profitable. In my mind, I come from
mm,
old school. We got to get
mm,
to profitability, but that's not the mentality in this world. Which is okay if you want to play that game of Russian roulette. That's what you're playing.
mm,
The
yeah,
reality is you're not going to get there.
yeah,
The 1 in 1,000 will get there,
yeah,
if that. So what game are you really playing? Do you want to just be on the roller coaster or that ride, or do you want to
yeah,
build a sustainable legacy that you can evolve over a longer period and a longer
yeah,
journey? So that's the thinking you got to have as you walk into this world, in my mind.
yeah. Yeah, and can't agree more. I think, if I were just to double click on what you said, business is about building profitability. And if you double click on that, you go, profitability comes from adding value. So
Yes.
you cannot be profitable if you're not adding any value in the industry or to the people that you're surrounded by. And the moment
Correct.
you start adding value, people give you the right to earn that margin. And I think it's very important to understand that relationship between profitability and that piece. And often, when you go to the VC route, sometimes that whole story of we'll 100x and then we will make profits sometimes confuses you, right,
Yeah.
along the way. And I've seen a lot of really good ideas and businesses and founders get lose their way along the way, where they completely lose sight of where does the value addition comes in. Um,
Fascinating.
right,
Yeah.
and to me, I think that was that moment where I kind of went, look, I've been there, done that, so I'm not fascinated by the VC journey as much anymore. I'm now actually more fascinated by how do you create sustainable value in such a way that the value can be reused to create more value,
Got it.
right? So in turn, you're looking at bootstrapping, or in turn, proving yourself, giving yourself a shot at, okay, I have a year to prove that I am creating value in this ecosystem. And if I'm not able to do that, I'll call it quits. I'll call it fair enough. I gave it a proper shot. I used my intellect, I used my resources, I used my money to try and create value in a year. It was a fair amount of time. Maybe it's not for me. I'll let the universe tell me. And if there is some value there, then it'll help me fund the next year, and then it'll help me fund the next year, and so on and so forth. And just being very honest to yourself about that.
If you can prove value in a year, you're onto something, right? And if you can start feeding yourself via customers' revenue, that's a different game. You're on a flywheel that will get you up the chain continuously as long as you continue to innovate, because everything changes quite quickly, right? So you might build value, and then after 5 years, that value is no longer served, and the industry's moved on. So we've got to continuously evolve with it. I've found some interesting businesses that have built substantial organizations off the back of consulting and keep feeding and innovating in an industry. And then at some point they want to scale, then they go and raise money at significant value. But they've got sustainable business models that have profitability, which is completely unknown in the world. Most of
100%.
what people are talking about and listening to on this podcast, especially if you want to just get a startup, it's that mentality of we will build something and we'll become profitable later. But I challenge that. If we've done something for 10 years and we've never been profitable, it's not easy to flick a switch and to become profitable like it is if we're overweight and never trained in a gym. It's
Yeah.
very difficult to flick the switch and now all of a sudden for the next 10 years I'm going to be in the gym. It's not that
And it's
simple.
unhealthy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's unhealthy if you think about it, right?
Yes.
For a startup or your body, if you we both are organisms that evolve. They cannot
Yes.
change overnight. So if you even did it, and let's say you had the wherewithal to do it, it'll be so unhealthy for long-term survival, because you've suddenly your brain thinks of you as a 80-kilo person, and you were
Yes.
woken up and you're suddenly 60 kilo, and your brain's still functioning as a 80-kilo
Yes.
body, right? And so it
Correct.
just
Yeah.
behaves differently, and there's so many downstream impact to that.
That's lazy into business. Now, let's go into the how. Now we understand the
Sure.
why. How? How might we do this? I've got a few stories we can share, but I'd love to hear from you as to how
Yeah.
you might go down this journey. You've mentioned it a little bit. You might go into corporate, generate a bit of cash flow, invest in yourself. And a lot of people are probably listening are knowledge-based workers. They've got some ideas and concepts in the spaces they're working in. So consider them some sort of domain expertise. They've got seen problems. And they're looking to take that leap. And you mentioned the lady you're having a chat to, Google, probably thinking around something, I'm imagining. Sometimes we take the leap off the back of concepts rather than just taking the leap blindly. That leap is obviously a big one because we've got this whole safety net and blanket that we've put in our mind. It's the reality is there's no safety net in corporate anyway. Your job can be gone tomorrow, like in anything. Build a startup, it can be
And it's
gone
getting
tomorrow.
worse. And
Yeah,
it's getting worse now,
yeah,
right? I think job security as a myth is getting more mythical.
yes,
I think people are starting to realize that loyalty is a construct in the job context, at least. And I think with AI around the corner, I think deep inside, a lot of people are feeling very, very insecure, because I think everyone's jobs and the value they can add is getting chipped away a little bit, especially in the knowledge space, with AI. And
agree.
who knows what robotics can do down the line, even in the non-knowledge space, right? So I think
True.
it's a very interesting sort of dynamic we are entering. But touching into the how, I think there are a few basics, and maybe this is where culturally growing up in an India where funding was not easily available, we sort of built that early muscle on how to constantly deal with scarcity,
Of
right?
course, good teachers resilience, teachers
Yes,
persistence, and
yes,
that's all the things you need when you walk into a business. There's
yeah.
absolutely nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, and I feel like I'm a little bit lucky in that sense where, I've sort of grown up in an ecosystem where funding was not taken for granted, and then I've been privileged enough to live in Australia where funding was not as hard as it used to be when we were back in the day. So I, sort of marrying the two, the way I think about it is, firstly, even at no matter what age you are at, I think trying to bring your base cost down to build something is very important. So, firstly, I think I don't know how many founders, I find very few, if I may call it Western founders, or where, there's a developing world and the developed world. And I find the developed world founders talk very little about keeping your cost base low.
Okay.
I think constantly pushing yourself to find that cheaper alternatives. So if Calendly is $100 a month or a year,
Yes.
I'm not even sure how much it is because I don't use it. There is a
Sure.
cheaper AppSumo alternative to Calendly that
Yeah.
is $50 a lifetime. Go look for that instead of
Yeah.
incurring that $100, and you don't realize it. It adds up.
Oh, it does significantly.
Okay.
Every cost is just hitting the bottom line, effectively. That's
Right.
what it's doing.
Yeah. And
Um,
especially at a
yeah.
startup stage, right? That eats into your runway. So the year that I was telling you about can
Yes.
easily become 18 months if you're cost conscious. So you
Hmm.
get an 18-month runway to prove to yourself you can do it or not. So I think
Yeah.
step one, be anal about every cost you incur. And it's not just one big cost to a consulting fee or something like that, but essentially, especially those recurring
The little
costs,
ones.
that the
Yeah.
$9.99, the $10, right?
Well, that teaches good habit, right? If we don't watch those little costs, they get out of control.
Yeah,
That's the reality. And I've been there in the
100%.
early start of the business. They get out of control. You think, whoa, we spent that much on
Yeah.
subscriptions.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's,
And Andrew, like I can't overstate this. In the early stages, if I go to a meeting, I take the bus, right? I'm not Ubering around. I try and spread the meeting out in a way that, it costs me a third to go to that
got
meeting.
it. We can
It
work on a bus, right? Too.
Yeah, yeah.
It takes
And
longer,
yeah,
but you can do other things.
yeah,
Interesting
yeah,
philosophy.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I know it sounds really cheap on my part, but it matters. At least that's what really works for me, to be able to put 100K in a business, but it acts like it's 500K because I'm
Nice one.
getting it to work 5x longer, right? So I think that makes a difference. Try and see if you can work with freelancers more than full-time devs. When you're building something. So I
Yes.
often try and work with freelancers in a way that they're going to get a portion of the equity, hourly pays, and so on and so forth. And I'm
Yes.
very shameless in saying that, look, I'm in an early stage and I don't have the budgets to actually employ your caliber of person. Is there a way for us to be able to do things? So cost base, all right. I'm not going to harp about this. I think where it gets more interesting is how do you look at sources of funding? So if you keep your cost base low and then you look at sources of funding, of course there is your own little seed capital. So if you
Yes.
have savings or if you have a partner who's working full time, so let them tackle fixed expenses in life, food and rent and whatnot.
It
Uh,
helps, right? So then
yeah,
you're working in it collectively together because if you can cover the cost base of the home, you're on the way.
yeah,
If you're struggling to pay the bills every week, you're going back to the corporate job or
yeah,
the job or anything because that's what
yeah,
will happen. You
yeah,
need to cover that out somehow to make this
yeah.
happen.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and thinking about that upfront usually really helps because then you have a realistic idea of what's that source. And then once you've got those two basics in place, I think that's when it starts to get really interesting because now you've created a space to work the first couple of months to put your idea down, pen on paper, all right, really flesh it out, maybe write a white paper, maybe start creating a prototype or an early prototype. I think don't be too precious about sharing your ideas with people because you'll be surprised. So one of the things I'll do is talk about the thing I'm building in great detail, and I'm never really worried about somebody copying it because it usually doesn't work like that. And secondly, if anything, people actually attach themselves to you if they
They
really
do,
like your idea.
yeah. That's the learning of the scene. Attachment is interesting, and then you might get other people that come along the journey, and that
Yeah,
creates more
yeah.
opportunity. I've been around founders that are scared to share, and you know that's not going to work.
No,
Build behind a curtain for 12 months and then
yeah,
showcase to the world is not going to work and not
no,
going to look very pretty.
no.
And there's countless stories of that on this podcast. We're 200 episodes in to many founders, and the ones that held on to their idea, if you're willing to go back and listen to 200 episodes, you'll find them. They're the ones that eventually failed because they
Mm,
weren't willing to learn and evolve.
mm,
Your product is never going to be, or your idea is going to evolve quickly, and you want people to come on the journey. So
yeah.
that's the massive takeaway for anyone listening in here.
Yeah, 100%. I think people are more forgiving than we give them credit for, right? And so, yeah, don't be too precious. Go out there, evangelize, or I'm not sure evangelize is a good word, but like share, share, share. And the more you socialize, I think that's when you start seeing a few avenues of social funding open. So one is you might actually start finding clients up front. And I know you briefly spoke about it. One
Did
of the
you?
big sources of funding for us, at least at Demtech, has been that we've had future clients believe in us and come and pay us in advance for a product we're about to build a couple of years down the line. And they say, look, here's the money, but you have to promise me if you build it and if it's a good product, then we're going to get a massive discount on it. And we've
Yeah.
agreed, right?
Yep.
So
Yep.
And that's a big source of funding for us.
When I speak to people about this, if you can't get a client to buy in, why would an investor?
Hmm.
It's the question you've got to be asking yourself, because there are options with clients, and we've done this in our business exactly the same. We've got a little product. It's a good revenue spinner in the world of pharmacy. There's about 600 active users on this product every month.
Hmm.
SaaS product that we built with one client. We knew they had a problem, that a product that was dying, that was old tech and not really scalable and challenging. We effectively approached them at the time. We had some inside information, which helps. So I saw an opportunity. I go, let's try this. Had a chat. And the same model. We discounted the product for a period of time. We even gave them a little bit of shared revenue for a period of time too. So there are different ways you can skin this cat if you want to look at it, because you can either go get an investor and give up 20-30% because your
Hmm.
value is little to nothing.
Yeah.
And an investor probably won't invest in such a product anyway because that is very niche and, from my mind, a good long-term profitable business, but not what an investor's looking for. And it's a very different model. So you need to know where you stand from a product perspective too. And if a customer
Absolutely.
won't buy it or invest in it, why would an investor? That's the question I ask myself all the time.
Absolutely. And that's great validation, like you said, right?
Yeah.
Like that's validation for yourself at a very early
Yes.
stage that you're on the right track. And
Correct.
customers are brutal in giving you feedback as well. So
Yes.
it's perfect. It's the best way to shape your product as well. So if, you know, in some ways you're finding product market fit even before your product is ready. Right. And
Yes.
it
Yeah.
sounds paradoxical, but it
Yeah.
actually works like that because the product is being co-designed, co-created by a client who's willing to invest in you. Right. So I think that's
Yeah.
been one of the big ones for us. Um, in addition to that, of course, you know, friends and family. So again, if you've spent some time, if your work ethic is well known, how you conducted yourself for the few years that you've been professionally known, I think I've always found that friends and family are also often very keen to back you up, because I think we are in a modern world where friends and family are always looking at you know, some way of diversifying their portfolio. So getting the right kind of friend and family around in, I think that's always beneficial. If some of them are in the same industry as you are, that even helps more because then they are sort of advisors to you who you trust from the get go because they're a friend and family.
Talk to me about that one, because I've always had that problem. I've never gone to friends and family. I've always done it on my own
Hmm.
because I don't want to risk friends and family's capital. Was always my thinking. So I've always attempted to do it on my own.
But you got to
Yeah.
be very
Yeah.
transparent with your friends and family. So to be
Yeah.
very clear,
Maybe that's
I
the
think
gap. Maybe that's the
when I
gap for
say
me
friends and
thinking.
family,
Yeah.
yeah, I've actually only taken money from friends and family who otherwise would feel that I'm leaving them out because they've
Okay.
seen this track
Got
record
it.
of startups and exits,
Yes.
and now some friends
Yes.
and families started to feel, hey, why do you
Hey.
never take money from me? Like, do you hate me?
That's a
And I'm
different
like,
problem.
no. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's like, no, mate, you should know
Yeah.
this is risky. But if
Yeah.
you still want to dabble a little bit,
Yeah.
all right, here's a small ticket. And then what you need to promise me is if I need a friend to help me out with, you know, standard accounting or legal stuff, and you're a
Yes.
lawyer, I might
Yep.
come to you for some free advice instead of paying you an hourly rate or a retainer. And I
Clever way of
usually
thinking.
take professionals' money so that they feel they're invested because they are getting fixed fee returns and so on.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
so friends and family in a very specific construct. But I agree with you. I would be very uncomfortable taking my brother's money or somebody else's money, giving them the 100x, you know,
Sell
this is
the
the
dream of
100x.
100x.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's very unlikely I'm building that
Yeah.
startup in the
Yes.
first place,
Got
right?
it.
So
Clear.
I think that's a very important qualifying criteria. I think you're right. And then and often friend and family, actually the point I wrote down for myself is friend and family debt. So I
Debt.
don't take it usually as equity. I actually take it as friend and family debt who don't need collateral,
Okay.
but you give them a fixed return, sort of like a convertible note, that if you
Yes.
do well, then it converts to equity.
Okay.
Otherwise, you're giving them a fixed return back. I've used that as a model, especially for my hostel business, because hostels are actually generating cash flow straight away.
Yeah, that's a
So
positive. Not
yeah,
all businesses are, though.
I
Especially
fully agree.
who are probably listening to this podcast. They're not going to be cash flow generating at the
Yeah.
beginning. They're going to be starting off the back of a paper napkin, as I'd say it, and they're really trying to convert. And I think the challenge for me with friends and family is I don't want to have to educate them, and I think that's quite an interesting place that you frame. Maybe focus around the ones that probably have concepts or construct around
Yeah.
what you're trying to achieve and maybe get it. You don't want to educate your uncle
No.
that's got no idea, and maybe it's yeah, that becomes a bit sketchy. So that's what I
No.
find for
100%.
me.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
got it.
and
Yeah,
usually the way it plays out is, and I'm not going to harp about this a bit more, too
sure.
much, but usually the way it plays out is, friends and family actually approach you. So you don't want to go creating a seminar for friends and family. What you want to do is, if
Yeah.
somebody's approached you, then that's the right person to have a
Okay.
conversation with. So if there is
Yes.
no inbound interest, then leave it.
Yeah,
Then
leave
it's
it
not a
alone.
channel. Yeah.
Okay,
So
understood. Yep,
yeah,
that's the
so
thing.
so
Yeah.
that's usually been one just in general. But I think the more interesting one, more recently, and in the last 5 to 7 years, it's become a much more steady place, is crowd investment or crowdfunding. Yeah, and I know we've
Talk to me
known
about
about
this. I've never
Kickstarters.
gone down this path, but we've heard. I've obviously
Yeah,
seen it. I've seen a few. I've never been around too many startups that have gone down this path. So yeah, fascinated to hear how that's gone for you and what you've seen.
yeah,
Yeah.
and look, I think, of course, if you're a product-based startup, there is established platforms like Kickstarter and Indiegogo in the past where,
Yes.
you sort of promise the product. It's sort of the future client,
Yep. It is similar.
investing today.
Yeah, you're selling
Yeah,
the future
yeah.
client. Buy this off the
Yeah,
back of a
yeah.
concept.
It's
Yes,
sort of
exactly
what
right.
Tesla and Elon Musk did. And I know I don't want to drop these big names, but with Model 3, 7, 8 years ago, that's what he did. He announced the product before it
Yeah,
was
it had
even
the product.
ready and being manufactured, right? And you just trusted the guy to make it. And you started putting a deposit down, and that allowed him to start building the gigafactory and start investing it and
Selling to
showing to.
first customers proves everything.
Absolutely.
Are people
Right.
buying
So
this?
yeah,
Yeah,
and
we
you need
de-risk
that
the whole
seed capital
organization.
to then go and borrow against it to say,
Yes.
I'm going to actually set up a physical infrastructure to build the product. So you start doing project financing of sorts from that. So then you can go to a bank and say, hey, fund me, because look at how many
Yes.
people have put down a deposit. Right. So I think
Makes it
it
easier.
really works in a physical product ecosystem where you do that. I think where it's starting to get very interesting is more recently it started going into the tech ecosystem. So
Yes.
if you look at crowdfunding platforms like vFunder, or even Seed Invest. I'm purposely saying these slowly so people can look them up. You'll see these are great sources where if you can tell your story clearly and articulately to an audience, and if you're able to think through the value that you bring to that investor, the macro investor, right? Because they're not going to be giving you hundreds of thousands of dollars as investment. They'll be giving you $500 or $1,000 here and there. Again, they're looking at spreading the chips on the roulette table to invest in 30, 40 different startups and potentially two of them converting into something meaningful. And the rest they understand is just going to be
Disappear.
their sort of social investment in some way, shape, and form.
Sure.
I think allows them to play in that ecosystem as an investor, but for you to be able to then crowdfund a seed capital of sorts. And I think a lot of people rule this source out completely. I think people should give it a
Dig
fair
more in.
shot.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I should, and especially if you're looking at that under 100K mark as a seed capital,
Got
right?
it.
If you want serious money, if you want a couple of $1 million, probably not the best place to go. Then you probably want to build out something more meaningful, get a
Yes.
revenue channel, and then go to those ecosystems. But if you're looking at, hey, I have already put in 20 grand, 30 grand, and I've validated something, and now I need the 100K to push it to the next level of
Next level.
production, right? I think then you already have a prototype and a story to tell, and that's where you want to sort of go to those channels. So I think at different stages of your journey, I think there are different options that open up for you. And then, of course, at post after this, you start looking at debt very seriously because now you have validation, you have
Revenue.
post revenue. You
Yes.
look at early seed, you look at pre-seed kind of stages where even folks at post revenue, early stages of revenue, not profitable but revenue forms, where you can start looking at one investor that actually gets it.
Yeah, and you mentioned debt. We had a podcast a few weeks ago with Tractor Ventures. So that model, if anyone's going to listen to what debt funding is. Crowdsourcing, we have virtual on years ago, but might need to dig in a little bit more at some of the names you've dropped. I've never entertained it. personally, and maybe others are not entertaining it either. They're looking at how might we just go after VCs, what people
Mm,
generally go after, but then the realization hits that VC's not coming until we have some revenue and or something going on,
mm,
or we've got a huge track record, we have multiple
mm.
exits or and a decent exit. So that's the kicker where
Yeah,
people get a
one
little
of the
bit lost.
biggest barriers, if I may say, and Andrew, for people going down the crowdfunding route, has
Yep.
traditionally been distribution of your
Okay.
story. So, like the
Okay.
biggest barrier, if you ask, especially introvert
Mm-hmm.
founders, they don't like the idea of putting themselves out there, telling the story. They almost feel uncomfortable,
Yep.
being that marketer or influencer type
Mm-hmm.
style of thing. I think what's important to realize that in the last couple of years, that barrier may have broken down a bit with AI and content creation and
Oh,
video
huge
generation.
breakdown. Yeah,
And I
huge
think
breakdown. Yeah.
you will see a flurry of that channel being tapped into now
Okay.
with, voice related, augmentation, video augmentation, storytelling or easy to make documentary to tell your story and what you're trying to do. And I
Yep.
think that barrier has sort of come down significantly. And I think now this channel looks a lot more attractive versus 3 years ago when you had to do the heavy lifting of
Yeah,
get a
on your
studio,
own. Yes.
get a content creator, tell the story. That's 100K, and then you're like, well, this is stupid to get 100K for 100K.
Yeah, it doesn't really work that way, does it? It's not really any added value there. Apurva, it's been a pleasure. We'll cut it there because we're going over, but I'll get you back on at some point for sure, just to dig into what you're doing at Demtech and what the goals are, etc. But thank you for coming on and sharing some opportunities and different ways to think about funding and how we might explore that, as well as some of the background and philosophy behind how you do things. There's some interesting things, knowledge based or people that are more domain experts, just to think about their career in a longer period, and maybe attach on to how you're considering your career as maybe we can work with corporate to educate, get better involved in an industry and understand, and then go out and try our own things. It's probably about setting up what's the long game that you're playing is probably the angle I took away from today. Thanks for coming on the DevReady podcast. It's been a pleasure, and love to hear from you again at some point.
The pleasure was all mine, Andrew. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.